She poured scalding coffee on my face because I refused to pay $40,000 for my sister's wedding. In that moment, everything shifted. The facade of family loyalty, the years of silent sacrifices, the weight of expectations. What happened next was more than a fight over money. It was the unraveling of every lie I'd been told about love and duty. Stay with me, because what followed wasn't just a confrontation. It was the first time I chose myself. My name is Mara Winslow. I'm 30 years old and work as a financial manager in Portland. My days are filled with numbers, investment portfolios, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing I can take care of myself. I'm not flashy, but I'm proud of the life I've built, a life that for the most part I keep separate from the chaos of my family. I'm engaged to Noah Sullivan, a software engineer whose passion for sustainability spills over into every corner of his life. With Noah, I feel safe in a way I never have before. It's not just the way he listens or how he holds me when I'm tired of holding everything else together. It's the way he sees me, truly sees me, and doesn't expect me to shrink myself to fit his world. My family, though, is a different story entirely. My mother, Irene, has always been the center of gravity in our home. She's the one who decides how holidays are spent, what secrets are kept, and who deserves her love on any given day. My father, Stan, is quiet, kind in his own way, but he avoids conflict like it might shatter him. Then there's my younger sister, Lana. At 27, she's still the golden girl in my mother's eyes, the one who can do no wrong, no matter how much she stumbles. I grew up in the shadow of that golden light. Lana was always the one with the easy laugh, the one who could charm a room without trying. My mother would beam at her like the sun itself had chosen to shine on Lana alone. "She's just special, Mara," she'd say, as if that explained everything. For me, there were different rules. I was the responsible one, the fixer, the one who was supposed to keep the peace. I learned early that my mother's approval was conditional. She'd hold it out like a prize, then snatch it away the moment I showed a hint of independence. "Why can't you be more like Lana?" she'd ask when I brought home another perfect report card, her voice dripping with disappointment instead of pride. "You're always so difficult." My father would just sigh and turn back to his newspaper or the TV. Conflict wasn't something he ever learned how to handle. He'd nod at me when I passed him in the hall, a silent apology in his eyes. But apologies don't build confidence. They don't fill the spaces where a child is supposed to feel seen and safe. So I learned to stop trying to earn their praise. I focused on what I could control. I got my first job at 16, stacking shelves in the corner grocery store while Lana was out with her friends. I didn't complain. I didn't dare. College was the same. My mother said community college would be enough. Why waste money on fancy degrees? But I had other plans. I applied to every scholarship I could find, pieced together loans and work-study shifts, and paid for every credit on my own. I graduated from university debt-laden, but determined every cent I earned, a testament to my ability to stand on my own. But even after I built my career, moving up from assistant to manager to overseeing millions in investments, the family dynamic never changed. My mother still saw me as the dependable one, the one she could lean on whenever the cracks in her perfect image started to show. And Lana, well, she was always the princess even when she floundered. When she lost her job, it was me who quietly paid her phone bill so she wouldn't lose touch with her friends. When our parents refinanced the house and got in over their heads, it was me who picked up the slack setting up anonymous payments so my mother wouldn't have to face the embarrassment of admitting she needed help. I did it all silently because that's what was expected. It was easier to swallow the resentment than to let it tear our already fragile family apart. It was easier to be the quiet hero than to risk being called selfish. But silence has a way of eating at you. It leaves you with a hollow ache, a question that starts as a whisper and grows into a roar. What about me? Noah was the first person who ever really asked that question on my behalf. "You're always taking care of everyone else," he'd say, his brow creased with worry. "But who takes care of you?" He didn't ask it to challenge me or to make me feel guilty. He asked it because he saw how much I'd given, how little I'd kept for myself. With him, for the first time, I started to believe I was allowed to have boundaries, that my worth wasn't measured by how much of myself I gave away. Our wedding plans became a quiet rebellion against everything I'd been taught at home. We wanted something simple, a small ceremony on the Oregon coast surrounded by the friends who had become my real family. No grand ballroom, no guest list of people I barely knew. Just us and the salty breeze and the promise that this new chapter would be one we wrote together. I dreamed of that day like a lighthouse on a rocky shore, steady and bright. It wasn't just about a wedding. It was about building a life where I could be whole, where I didn't have to keep cutting pieces of myself away to make room for everyone else. I wanted to believe that was possible, that I could stand at the altar with Noah and say I do not just to him, but to the life I'd always been too afraid to choose for myself. But even as I let myself hope, there was a part of me that braced for the storm. Because in my family, love was always tangled with obligation. And I knew, deep down, I wouldn't be able to hold on to this new beginning without first facing the old wounds that had never really healed. Lana's engagement party was exactly what my mother Irene had always dreamed of, grand and carefully curated, with every detail just right. The house was transformed into a shimmering display of pale pink and gold candles flickering in crystal holders, the air thick with the scent of roses and expensive catering. My mother moved through it all like a queen in her domain, orchestrating the event with practiced ease. I was there, of course, but not as a guest. I was the quiet helper, the one making sure the gifts were stacked neatly and the champagne flowed without interruption, the one who knew how to disappear into the background even as I kept everything running smoothly. It was a role I'd perfected over the years, indispensable, invisible, and always there to prop up the family image. The real star of the evening was Lana. She floated through the crowd in a dress of champagne satin, her laughter ringing out like music. Next to her was Carter, the man she'd been seeing for less than a year. He was all easy smiles and perfect hair, the kind of man my mother had always imagined for Lana, a man with the right pedigree even if his bank account didn't match his charm. He's exactly what Lana deserves. My mother had said, dismissing any concerns I'd raised about his spotty work history. He comes from a good family. That's what matters. As if love or stability had anything to do with it. I watched them from the edge of the party holding a glass of sparkling water I'd been nursing all night. Lana looked radiant. She'd always known how to step into the spotlight effortlessly while I hovered in the wings. And even now, as a grown woman with a life and a partner of my own, I still felt like the understudy in her show. It was Noah's words that kept me grounded in that moment. Noah, who wasn't here tonight because of a work conflict, but who had reminded me before I left, "You don't have to say yes to everything, Mara. It's okay to protect what's yours." I clung to that thought like a lifeline. I was lost in those thoughts when my mother appeared beside me. She took my arm lightly, guiding me away from the music and laughter into the dimly lit garden. The party sounds faded behind us, replaced by the soft rustle of wind through the trees. "Mara," she said, her voice gentle in a way that always made me nervous. "I wanted to talk to you about something important." I stiffened, bracing for the ask I felt coming. In my family, important conversations usually meant new obligations for me. "You know how much this means to Lana?" She began, her eyes bright with a fierce, almost desperate light. "This engagement, it's everything she's ever dreamed of. She deserves a wedding that matches her heart." I stayed silent, feeling my stomach twist. I knew where this was going, and I could already hear Noah's voice in my mind telling me it was okay to say no. My mother continued, her hand tightening on my arm. "Your father and I have done what we can, but, well, you know we're not in the best position right now. But you." She let the word hang in the air, her eyes searching mine for weakness. "You're doing so well, Mara. You're successful. Surely you can help your sister have the wedding she deserves." I took a breath, steadying my voice. "How much are you asking for?" "Just $40,000, she said. Like it was nothing. Like it was the price of a nice dress, not the entire budget for my own wedding. The ceremony Noah and I had planned on the Oregon coast, just the two of us, and the people who mattered. I felt the words catch in my throat, but I forced them out anyway. "Mom," I said quietly, "I can't. Noah and I have our own wedding to pay for. We've been saving for this for years." Her expression hardened immediately, her mouth pulling into a tight line. "Mara," she said, her voice low and sharp, "don't be selfish. Family comes first. Your sister needs you. How can you stand there and refuse to help when you have so much? I felt a flash of anger then, quick and hot. I'm not refusing to help Mom, I said. I'm refusing to sacrifice my own future to pay for someone else's dream. That's not selfish. It's necessary. Her eyes flashed with something I couldn't quite name. Hurt, maybe, or fury. You've changed, she said, softly shaking her head. I thought family meant more to you than this. I swallowed hard, feeling the old ache of guilt rising in my chest. But I held my ground, remembering the years I'd spent picking up the pieces of everyone else's messes, remembering how it had never been enough no matter how much I gave. I love this family, I said, my voice shaking a little, but I can't keep giving and giving until there's nothing left for me. She didn't answer. She just turned and walked back toward the party, leaving me standing in the dark with the weight of her disappointment pressing against my ribs. I watched her go, the lights from the party spilling around her like a halo she didn't deserve. For a moment I felt like that little girl again, the one who would have done anything to make her mother proud. But as I stood there alone and quiet, I felt something shift inside me. I realized I wasn't that girl anymore. I was a woman who had learned how to say no even when it hurt, even when it meant disappointing the people I'd spent my whole life trying to please. And in that small, silent victory, I found a glimmer of the strength I'd been searching for all along. The air at the party had grown thick with forced laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes. Music drifted from the speakers in the living room, but I couldn't hear the melody over the steady drum of my own pulse. I stood at the edge of the room near a small table adorned with delicate desserts I'd helped arrange earlier that day, feeling like a shadow at someone else's celebration. My mother's voice cut through the chatter, bright and polished, as she recounted Lana's engagement story for the third time that evening. She stood in the center of the room, like a conductor, her words orchestrating every head nod and smile of approval. Lana and Carter are just perfect together, she said, her hand lightly touching Lana's shoulder. We're so proud of her. She's always known how to bring people together. I watched from a distance, my glass of sparkling water growing warm in my hand. My mother didn't mention me, didn't acknowledge that I was even there. I was used to it by now, her ability to erase me from the narrative without ever saying a word. But that night, standing in the glow of the fairy lights and soft music, I felt every omission like a small cut across my skin. My mother caught my gaze for a moment, her eyes narrowing just enough for me to see the question she hadn't yet voiced. I knew it was coming, the question that had been simmering between us since that moment in the garden. She didn't need to say it out loud. I could already hear it in the way she held her shoulders, the way she glanced at me as if weighing my usefulness. She moved through the room with practiced grace, a fresh cup of coffee in her hand. When she reached me, she paused, her smile brittle and bright. Mara, she said, her voice honeyed as if she were sharing a secret. I was just telling everyone how supportive you've always been, how generous. Her words felt like a trap, every syllable meant to bind me to a role I no longer wanted to play. She didn't wait for my response. I'm sure you've reconsidered, she continued, her tone light but her eyes sharp. About helping your sister. It would mean so much to her. She deserves a wedding that matches her heart. My chest tightened. All around us the conversation paused, the hum of small talk fading into a curious hush. People turned to look at us, some with polite interest, others with the careful curiosity of those who sense a storm brewing. I took a breath, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. I'm sorry, Mom, I said, my voice steady, but my answer is still no. For a moment, there was silence, thick and suffocating. My mother's smile slipped, her lips tightening as she tried to hold on to the perfect facade she'd built. Mara, she said, her voice a low warning, this isn't about you. This is about family, about loyalty. I felt my pulse quicken, but I didn't look away. I know, Mom, I said softly, and I've been loyal my whole life, but I can't do this. I won't. Her face changed, then the practiced smile cracking like ice underfoot. Her hand trembled just slightly as she shifted her coffee cup, her knuckles whitening around the delicate porcelain. How dare you, she whispered, her voice sharp enough to cut. After everything we've done for you. I opened my mouth to speak, to remind her that I had never asked for anything. That I had paid my own way covered their debts in silence, given until there was nothing left to give. But the words caught in my throat, and in that hesitation, I saw her fury bloom. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her hand in warning. She simply let the cup tilt, the coffee sloshing over the edge in a single scalding arc that caught me square across the cheek. The pain was immediate, white-hot and blinding. I gasped, the breath catching in my chest as the liquid burned down my neck, soaking into the fabric of my dress. My eyes stung with tears, but I blinked them back, refusing to let them spill over. Around me, the party fell into stunned silence. Lana clapped her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Carter shifted his weight awkwardly, looking everywhere but at me. My father stood a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the floor, his shoulders hunched as if he could make himself disappear. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had narrowed to that small, searing pain on my skin and the sharp tang of coffee in the air. My mother's hand was still outstretched, the empty cup trembling in her grip. She looked at me as if I'd forced her hand, as if I'd somehow left her no choice. "Mara," she hissed, her voice raw and shaking. "Look what you made me do." I touched my cheek lightly, feeling the burn, the wet fabric clinging to my collarbone. My mind was a blur, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice rose up, clear and resolute. "No," it said. "You didn't make her do this. She chose it." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not a mother but a woman so consumed by her own need for control that she would rather burn me than face her own disappointment. I took a shaky breath and straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of the coffee-drenched dress against my skin. Around us no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if time itself had paused, the music still playing faintly in another room, absurdly out of place in the heavy silence. I didn't bother to wipe my cheek. I didn't shrink away or try to explain. Instead, I held her gaze for a long, quiet moment, and then I turned and walked out of the room, away from her, away from the stunned stares and the whispers that would follow. I walked because there was nothing left to say, because in that moment I understood that no apology or explanation would ever be enough to fill the void her actions had carved between us. And in that quiet exit, I felt something shift deep inside me, like a door finally clicking shut, leaving behind only the echo of everything I'd given and everything I would no longer give. I don't remember how long I stood there, coffee cooling on my skin, the whispers of stunned guests swirling around me like a low hum. My mind was a blur of pain and disbelief, every breath sharp against the raw burn on my cheek. I felt the weight of my mother's eyes, the silence of my father, the anxious flutter of Lana's hands covering her mouth. And in that heavy pause I realized there was nothing left for me to say. Then through the door Noah appeared. He was still in his work clothes, dark slacks, sleeves rolled up, the faintest trace of worry in the crease between his brows. His eyes swept over the scene and landed on me, and in that single glance I saw every emotion he couldn't voice in the middle of a room full of strangers. Concern, anger, love. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hand gentle on my elbow. "Mara," he said softly, his thumb brushing a damp strand of hair from my forehead. There was no judgment in his voice, no demand for explanation, just the quiet certainty of someone who had always known I carried too much. "I'm okay," I tried to say, but the words caught in my throat. My skin still stung, and the room still felt too small, too close. But when Noah looked at me, I could breathe again. He didn't ask for permission. He simply wrapped his arm around my shoulders and led me out of the house, past the shocked faces and the stunned silence. Outside, the cool night air hit my skin, and I shivered. Noah slipped off his jacket and draped it around my shoulders, his hand lingering at the back of my neck. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady. No hesitation, no second guessing. The drive to the hospital was quiet, the hum of the tires on the road a soft counterpoint to the thoughts racing through my mind. I stared out the window, the streetlights blurring into streaks of gold. My mother's voice still echoed in my ears, accusations of selfishness, of betrayal. But here, in the soft glow of the dashboard lights, I felt those words begin to lose their power. Noah kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on my leg. He didn't fill the silence with questions or reassurances. He just let it be, giving me space to find my own words. Finally, I turned to him, my voice low and trembling. "I didn't think she would actually do it," I whispered. "I knew she'd be angry, but I never thought she'd go that far." He glanced at me, his eyes dark with something that wasn't quite surprise. "You've carried her expectations for a long time," he said softly. "Longer than anyone should have to. But tonight you showed her that her power over you has limits." I swallowed hard, the truth of his words sinking in like warm water in cold soil. I hadn't thought of it that way, not as defiance but as a line I had drawn at last. At the hospital, a nurse cleaned my face with gentle hands, the antiseptic cool and sharp against my skin. The doctor, a woman with kind eyes, examined the burn and gave me a small smile. "First degree," she said. "Painful, but it will heal well." She handed me a small tube of burn cream and a set of instructions. "Keep it clean and let it breathe," she said, "and don't be afraid to let it show." I nodded, the words settling somewhere deep inside me. Let it show. Let it breathe. When she left the room, Noah reached for my hand. His thumb brushed the inside of my wrist, a small, steady pressure that made my breath catch. "You know," he said quietly, his eyes locked on mine, "this isn't just about what happened tonight." I frowned, confusion clouding the relief I'd started to feel. "What do you mean?" He squeezed my hand gently. "This isn't just a burn on your skin, Mara," he said. "It's a line you drew, one you've needed to draw for a long time. It's proof that you don't have to keep sacrificing yourself to make everyone else comfortable." Tears welled up in my eyes, hot and unbidden. "I keep wondering if I was wrong," I whispered. "If saying no makes me cruel. If I'm just selfish." He leaned forward, his forehead resting lightly against mine. "No," he said firmly. "Saying no doesn't make you cruel. It makes you human. It means you know your own worth. And if that feels selfish to people who only saw you as a means to an end, then maybe it's time for them to learn what real love looks like." His words were like balm on a wound I hadn't even realized was still bleeding. I closed my eyes, letting them settle into the quiet spaces of my heart. I thought of all the years I'd spent trying to be everything to everyone, how I'd twisted myself into smaller and smaller shapes, hoping that if I was good enough, kind enough, I'd finally be seen, finally be loved. But Noah didn't want me to be smaller. He didn't want me to fold myself into someone else's expectations. He wanted me whole, even if it meant standing alone for a while. For the first time, I let myself believe that maybe he was right. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the night begin to lift. My skin still burned, but inside something had shifted. The old fear, of being unloved, of being seen as the villain, had begun to loosen its hold. In its place was something quieter but stronger, the knowledge that my worth wasn't up for debate. Noah squeezed my hand again, his smile small but sure. "You're not alone," he said softly. "Not tonight. Not ever." I nodded, the tears finally spilling over. But this time they didn't feel like shame. They felt like relief. Because in that hospital room under the flickering fluorescent lights, I finally believed it. Saying no to her didn't mean I was heartless. It meant I was finally ready to choose myself. The next day, Noah and I returned to the house where everything had started. The party was long over. No more laughter echoing off the walls. No more carefully arranged flowers hiding the cracks in the family's foundation. It was just us standing in the doorway of a place that had always been both a home and a battlefield. I didn't come back to demand an apology. I didn't come to reclaim something that had never really been mine. I came back because I needed them to see me, truly see me, for the first time in my life. And Noah stood beside me, a quiet presence of unwavering support. The living room was quiet. When we stepped inside, the smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. My mother, Irene, was seated on the couch, her posture stiff and proud as always. My father, Stan, hovered by the fireplace, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes darting between us like a man caught in a storm he didn't know how to weather. Lana stood near the window, her arms folded across her chest, her expression wary but curious. Noah's hand found mine, his fingers warm and steady. He didn't say anything at first. He just waited, giving me the choice to speak or to let the silence do it for me. But I had spent too many years letting silence speak for me. This time I was ready to use my voice. I took a breath and looked at my mother. "I'm not here to fight," I said softly. "I'm here because I need you to understand that what happened last night changes everything." My mother's eyes narrowed, her lips tightening as if she were holding back 100 sharp words. But before she could speak, Noah stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "Mara doesn't owe you anything," he said evenly. "She never has. For the past 3 years, she's been paying off this house, quietly without recognition, because she wanted to give you all some measure of security. Not because she was obligated, because she chose to." A hush fell over the room. My mother's face went pale, her hand gripping the arm of the couch until her knuckles whitened. My father's head jerked up, his eyes wide with something that looked almost like shock. And Lana's mouth fell open, her eyes flicking to me as if she were seeing me for the first time. Noah's voice didn't waver. "Mara has been carrying this family's burdens long enough," he said. "She's done it out of love, out of duty. But that doesn't mean she has to keep giving until there's nothing left. She doesn't owe anyone an explanation or an apology for choosing her own happiness now." My mother opened her mouth, but no words came out. I could see the fury there, warring with something else, something that looked almost like fear. My father's shoulders slumped, the weight of what he'd just learned settling into the lines of his face. Lana was the first to speak. Her voice was small, hesitant. You did that?" she asked, her tone almost disbelieving. "You paid off the house." I nodded, my throat tight but my gaze steady. "Yes," I said simply, "because I believed you deserved a chance to find your own way. But I can't keep sacrificing my future so you can have yours." Lana blinked, her eyes bright with something I couldn't name. Regret maybe, or a kind of startled understanding. "I didn't know," she whispered. I thought you were just holding out. I didn't know you'd already given so much." I gave her a small, sad smile. "I know you didn't," I said. "And I don't blame you for that. But I need you to understand. Love isn't about giving until you're empty. It's about knowing when to stop, even if it breaks your heart." My father cleared his throat, his voice rough when he finally spoke. "Mara," he set, his eyes on mine for the first time in what felt like years. I didn't realize. I should have seen it. I should have stopped it before it got this far." I didn't have the words to answer him, but I saw the truth in his eyes. The weight of a man who had finally woken up to the part he'd played in all of this. And in that moment, I felt a small measure of peace. My mother looked at me, then her lips pressed into a thin line. "You've always been so stubborn," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I thought if I pushed hard enough, you'd understand what family means. But maybe I was wrong." I didn't answer her. There was nothing left to say to a woman who measured love in what I could give, not in who I was. Instead, I turned to Lana, my voice gentle but firm. "I want you to have everything you dream of, Lana," I said. "But I can't keep giving up my own dreams to make that happen. That's not love. That's erasure." Lana swallowed, her eyes glistening. I think I'm starting to understand," she said quietly. "I don't know what to do with it yet, but I hear you." I gave her a small nod, the tightness in my chest easing just a fraction. "That's all I wanted," I said. "For you to hear me." Noah's hand slipped back into mine, his thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles. In the quiet that followed, I felt the shift in the room. The way the truth once spoken had a weight of its own. It didn't fix everything, but it was a start. As we turned to leave, I didn't look back at my mother. I didn't need to. For the first time, I felt the truth settle in my bones. I didn't need her approval to be whole. I didn't need her acceptance to know my own worth. Because the real measure of love isn't in what we're willing to give away. It's in what we choose to protect. And that day I chose myself. In the days that followed, the house that once felt so familiar became a place of quiet fractures. My mother moved through its rooms like a ghost, her eyes rimmed red from crying, her voice tight with accusations. She wept into the phone with relatives, crafting a narrative in which I was the cold-hearted daughter who had turned her back on family. She said I was ungrateful, that I had always been difficult, twisting the story until even I almost believed it, if only for a moment. But I didn't let those words sink in this time. I had spent too many years letting her version of me shape my own reflection. Now I understood that her tears were not an apology. They were another attempt to draw me back into a role I no longer wanted to play. She called and texted in bursts, each message laced with guilt and manipulation. "You're tearing this family apart," one read. "I raised you better than this," said another. But I didn't reply. I let the words sit there unanswered, because I was done justifying myself for choosing my own life. My father said nothing at first. He moved around the house like a man trapped between two worlds, his shoulders heavy with the weight of decades of quiet compromise. He didn't speak up in front of my mother. He never had. But one night my phone buzzed with a message that made me stop in my tracks. "I'm sorry," he wrote simply. "I should have said something a long time ago. I see it now, Mara. I promise I won't stand by and watch you carry this alone anymore." I stared at those words, feeling a strange mixture of relief and grief. I had wanted so badly for so long for him to see me. Not the daughter who filled the silence in our family, but the woman who had learned to stand in her own light. His message wasn't everything, but it was something. A crack in the wall I'd been pushing against my entire life. Lana reached out to me a few days later. She came to my apartment, her hands twisting nervously around the strap of her purse. For the first time in years, she looked at me without the veil of mother's approval clouding her gaze. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "I didn't see it. I let her make me into someone I don't even recognize anymore. I thought you were just being stubborn, but I see it now. I'm so sorry, Mara." I let her words wash over me, feeling the truth in them. I didn't rush to forgive her, though. I wasn't ready to bridge the gap that had been widened by years of favoritism and my own silence. But in her eyes I saw a glimmer of something I hadn't seen before: accountability. And that was enough to plant a seed of hope. "It's going to take time," I said softly. "For both of us." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, and I reached for her hand, not in forgiveness but in recognition. This was a start. And through it all, Noah was there, steady and unshakable. He didn't offer empty reassurances or push me to make peace before I was ready. He didn't ask me to be okay for his sake. He simply stayed close, his presence a quiet testament to the love that didn't need to be proven. One night, as I sat curled on the couch staring at the city lights outside the window, he wrapped an arm around my shoulders and pressed a kiss to my temple. "I'm so proud of you," he murmured. "Not for what you've done for them, but for what you're finally doing for yourself." I leaned into him, feeling the truth of his words settle into the places where old doubts had lived for so long. He didn't need me to explain the guilt or the confusion that still flickered at the edges of my mind. He just let me feel it, holding me through the moments when I wasn't sure if I'd done the right thing, even though I knew deep down that I had. In his quiet strength, I found a kind of shelter I'd never known in my childhood home, a place where I didn't have to prove my worth or apologize for my boundaries. With him, I felt seen, not as the dutiful daughter or the perpetual fixer, but as a woman who deserved love that didn't come with conditions. My mother's tears didn't move me the way they once had. My father's apology was a small beginning, and Lana's halting honesty was the first step toward something different. But Noah's unwavering presence was the anchor that kept me steady as I navigated the shifting tides of my family's unraveling. I didn't know what would come next, if bridges would be mended or if some would stay burned forever. But I knew this much: I wouldn't lose myself trying to hold them up anymore. And in that quiet determination, I found a peace that felt more real than any apology or promise ever could. In the quiet weeks that followed, I turned inward, searching for something I had never fully claimed: my own voice. For so long, my days had been filled with the echoes of my mother's demands, the weight of everyone's expectations but my own. Now, in the soft spaces between conversations and the stillness of my mornings, I let myself finally listen to the quiet whispers of what I needed. I started therapy. At first it felt strange, like I was speaking a language I had only ever understood in silence. But my therapist's gentle questions were like small doors, each one opening to a part of me I had learned to hide. She taught me how to name the hurt I had carried, how to hold it in my hands without letting it define me. It wasn't your job to be everything for everyone, she said, during one of our sessions, her voice soft but firm. It's okay to take up space, to be seen for who you are, not just what you give. I carried those words home with me, turning them over in my mind until they began to feel real. In the evenings, I took out an old leather-bound notebook and started to write. At first, the words came slowly, hesitant, halting. But soon the pen found its rhythm, and the thoughts I had kept locked away began to flow. I am worthy of love and respect. I wrote one night, the words trembling on the page. It was the first time I had ever said it out loud, even if only to myself. I read it over and over, letting it sink into the places where old doubts still lingered. Noah was there as he always had been. He didn't hover or push, didn't try to fix what wasn't his to mend. He just listened when I needed to talk and held me when the weight of everything felt too heavy to bear alone. His presence was like the gentle warmth of a sunlit morning, patient and unwavering. We sat together at our kitchen table, the one we had picked out at a second-hand shop, and spread out the final plans for our wedding. A small ceremony on the Oregon coast, just us, and the handful of friends who had become family by choice. There would be no grand speeches or crowded ballrooms, just the sound of the waves and the promise that this was a life we were choosing together, free from the expectations of anyone else. As we finalized the guest list, I realized I wasn't afraid of my mother's absence. I wasn't afraid of her disappointment or her sharp tongue. I knew finally that her approval wasn't the measure of my worth. For the first time, I felt that I could stand at that altar with Noah and know, truly know, that I wasn't leaving any part of myself behind. Lana, too, was beginning her own quiet rebellion. She found a job at a small marketing agency, her first real step towards something that was hers alone. She didn't ask for help, didn't lean on my mother's carefully curated safety net. She just did it. And when she called to tell me the news, there was a spark in her voice I hadn't heard before. I don't know if I'm good at it yet, she admitted, a small laugh at the edge of her words, but it feels like mine. I did know. And I told her so. I'm proud of you, I said, meaning every word. Not because you're perfect, but because you're trying, because you're choosing your own path. She paused, and I could hear the smile in her voice. You've always been braver than me, Mara, she said softly. Watching you, it made me believe I could be braver too. Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. I realized then that change isn't something you can force on someone else. You can't drag them toward healing or push them into the light. But you can live your truth out loud, and in doing so, you create a kind of permission for others to do the same. Healing, I was learning, wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up for myself every day, even when it was hard. It was about forgiving myself for the times I stayed quiet, for the years I gave too much. It was about believing that I could build something different from the patterns I had been born into. Each morning I woke up a little lighter. Each night I went to bed a little more sure of the woman I was becoming. And in the soft glow of those small, steady changes, I found the kind of peace I'd spent my whole life searching for. Noah would sometimes catch me lost in thought and smile, his eyes gentle. You're finding your way, he'd say, his hand resting lightly on mine. And I would smile back because I knew he was right. For the first time, I was writing a story that belonged to me alone. A story that didn't hinge on someone else's needs or someone else's love. A story where I could stand in my own light and know, truly know, that I was enough. The morning of my wedding arrived quietly, the Oregon sky, a gentle canvas of pale blue. The salty air from the ocean carried a kind of calm I had never known in my childhood home, an assurance that here in this place I was free to start over. The wind played with the hem of my simple white dress, lifting it in soft ripples, as if to remind me that nothing was meant to be held too tightly. The ceremony was small, just as Noah and I had planned. A driftwood arch we'd built together, wildflowers gathered from the fields nearby, and a handful of friends who had become our chosen family. There were no grand declarations or choreographed moments, just the quiet certainty that we were exactly where we were meant to be. My mother was not there. There was no dramatic exit or last-minute reconciliation. She chose not to come, and I chose not to invite her back in. And in that choice, I felt a kind of peace that I had never expected to find. Her absence was a testament to the boundaries I had learned to hold, a quiet celebration of the life I was finally allowed to live without apology. My father was there, though. He stood beside me as we prepared to walk down the narrow aisle that led to Noah, his hand warm around mine. He looked at me with eyes that were both proud and sad, a man who had seen more than he had ever said. "You know," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I've spent a long time wishing I could have protected you more. But today I'm just proud that you didn't let any of it break you." His words wrapped around my heart like a promise, and I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes. Tears not of pain, but of release, of knowing that even if the past could not be undone, it didn't have to define me anymore. When we reached the end of the aisle, he squeezed my hand one last time. A single tear slipped down his cheek, glinting in the morning light. "I love you, Mara," he said, "and I'm so glad you never stopped loving yourself." I stepped forward to meet Noah, my heart steady in my chest. He took my hands in his thumb brushing over my knuckles in a silent vow. Around us, the waves whispered against the shore, the wind carrying away the last echoes of the life I had left behind. After the ceremony, we walked together along the sand, our footprints trailing behind us in the wet earth. The sun was warm on my shoulders, and every breath felt like a promise I was finally ready to keep. Noah didn't say much. He didn't have to. His presence was enough, a quiet reassurance that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. That evening, we shared a small meal with our friends, laughter ringing out under the soft glow of fairy lights. There was no tension, no expectation, just the simple joy of being with people who saw me not for what I could give but for who I was. And in their warmth, I found the family I had spent so long searching for. Later, as Noah and I watched the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that this wasn't just a new chapter. It was a whole new story. One where I didn't have to carry the weight of other people's demands, where I didn't have to prove my worth through endless sacrifice. We sat in the quiet, our hands entwined, and I thought of all the ways I had learned to say no. No to the roles I was never meant to play. No to the voices that told me love was something you had to earn by giving until there was nothing left. No to the guilt that had lived like a shadow in my chest for far too long. And in that space where the old expectations used to be, I felt something bloom, a soft, steady certainty that I was enough exactly as I was. Noah turned to me, his eyes reflecting the last glow of the day. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice gentle but sure. I nodded, a smile breaking across my face. "I'm more than ready," I said. "Because for the first time, I'm not walking away from something. I'm walking toward everything I've been waiting for." He kissed my forehead, and together we stood to face the night, the waves singing softly at our backs. We didn't need to speak the promises that lived in our hearts. They were written in the way he held my hand, in the way my shoulders no longer hunched against the weight of expectation. As we stepped forward, I let myself believe in the truth I had fought so long to claim, that love is never meant to be measured by how much of yourself you're willing to lose. That real love, whether from family, friends, or the quiet voice inside you, doesn't ask you to disappear. It asks you to stand in your own light and know that you are worthy of it all. And so under that soft Oregon sky, I finally let myself say the words I had never dared to write in any journal, never dared to speak to anyone but myself. I have learned that love doesn't mean giving until you're empty. It means learning to say no to the people and the patterns that would have you believe you're only valuable when you're useful. And I have learned that peace doesn't come from making everyone else happy. It comes from daring to claim the life that makes you feel whole. I took Noah's hand in mine, and together we walked into the future that waited just beyond the dunes. One step, one breath, one soft, unwavering yes to ourselves. Thank you for being here with me today. My hope is that in sharing this story, you found a moment to reflect on your own boundaries, your own worth, and the quiet power of choosing yourself, no matter how hard it might be. Have you ever faced a moment where saying no felt like the hardest yet most necessary thing you could do? How did it feel to stand up for yourself when everyone else expected you to stay small? I'd love to hear your stories, your reflections, and your thoughts in the comments below. Let's create a space where we can support one another, where we can remind each other that choosing ourselves is an act of love, not of selfishness. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to ring that notification bell. There are so many more stories to share. Stories of healing, of growth, and of finding your voice in a world that doesn't always want to hear it. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are always worthy of love just as you are.